Welcome back to the ByteTalk podcast. My name is Johnny Lundy, and this is my good friend Zeno Rocha. Together, we talk with some of the most productive people in tech. We discuss tooling, setups, open source, no-code, startups, big tech, and much more. Today, we would like to welcome Rob Dodson. Am I saying that right, Dodson?
Yeah, that's right.
Awesome. Great to have you.
Oh, Rob, yeah, we're super excited to have you here, Rob. I know you for a long time, and I believe we met around 2013 or 14, something like that.
Yeah.
And that's when you were transitioning to work at Google as a developer advocate, right? So I'm really curious to hear from you, how was that move? You're a software engineer, and now you have to do a completely different kind of job. So how was it?
That's an interesting question. So prior to working at Google, I was freelance, and I was working a lot on design systems. So I was working at General Electric at the time on their design system. And so, it's just a lot of day-to-day, right? You got a bunch of Jira tickets that you're just kind of plowing through. And kind of on the side, I was writing a lot at the time. I was really interested in web components because I thought, these would fit really well for all this design system work that we're doing. And Google reached out because of the writing that I was doing. And definitely one of the most interesting things about the transition is how you go from, I would say a pretty structured role, again, right, you got your bug tracker, you got your sprint goals and things like that, just something which is much less structured, with developer relations, where it becomes much more on you to figure out, okay, here's kind of this initiative or this particular API or something that Chrome really cares about and wants to get on developers' radars. How do we actually do that? And it's so different from just working on UI code and working on features, because now it's a combination of education and outreach, and a lot of self-directed planning. It's kind of up to you to come up with the strategy, being the person who sort of has their finger on the pulse of the community, thinking, okay, how are we going to get our community interested in this stuff? So that was probably one of the biggest changes for me, day to day. It was just that mind shift of okay, it's no longer about closing tickets. Now it's about coming up with a plan to get people really, really excited about something, and also get their feedback so I can give that back to the Chrome team as people are trying it out early on.
And now, I noticed now you are a staff developer advocate, right? So what is the difference between just a regular developer advocate and now in that sort of position?
I think it's a lot of tech companies, they have job ladders, and so staff is it's the 6th level or whatever within Google Developer Relations. It feels a little bit like Dungeons and Dragons, it's definitely so now at this level it's more around leading bigger initiatives or leading a team of people. So when I first started as a developer advocate, I was taking direction, and I was working with a team of folks, and my manager would sort of help steer my work. And now I manage a group of I think I have 4 people and 3 contractors that I manage. And so now it's about trying to say, okay, cool, what can we do collectively as a group to achieve our goals? Definitely the biggest change has been not being an individual contributor anymore, but now again trying to sort of set the direction for people. That is a really, really hard mind shift. It's so hard not to just be I'm just going to get in there and do it myself. You have to resist that urge. And that for me has been definitely a big learning experience. And this was, 2020 was my first year being a manager, so it was kind of a total curveball, being welcome, you're a manager. Also, none of us are going to be in person anymore. So, and my team, it's also, it's very spread out geographically. So I have a person in Sydney, I have a person in Zurich, Switzerland, I have a person in San Francisco, or 2 people in San Francisco with me. So that's been another interesting challenge there, is just dealing with such a big distributed team. Well, small, I guess, but big to me, but distributed team. Yeah.
So you went from like individual contributor to then like this very nebulous self-prioritization mode, and then now you're in like prioritizing for a whole team. What did you have to learn, like in your just in your own development, like to go through that process, or what are the takeaways you had?
I think one of the things that is often really difficult to communicate between, or it's maybe just not communicated well between people, is like, what is the most important thing for someone to be working on right now? And I guess what I mean by that is I sort of started to realize this once I became a manager, that oftentimes I feel like managers and their reports are not having this conversation of what is, basically the report asking the manager, what is the most important thing for me to be working on right now? Sometimes that's actually left somewhat unsaid. And so you can end up in these situations where people are like doing work, right? And you're like, this is good that you're doing that work, but we're like missing, we're not, like, these bigger, more important initiatives are not happening. And sometimes it's just not clear, right? That communication is not happening between the two of you, that, hey, this thing is actually a higher priority than this other thing. And it's very hard because our work tends to be very fluid too. Like you're working away on something, suddenly this thing pops up, now it's more important, you got to address that thing, but you can't lose sight of the bigger, longer initiative that you're working on, right? You still got to finish those like big quarterly or, yearly OKRs or whatever. So I think that's been a big shift, is just making sure I'm communicating well to people around what's our priority. And then the other thing is around just like expectation setting. I think that's actually been interesting for me. Like everyone has different work styles. And so for a team to kind of like function, I think you have to understand, okay, how do different people work, but also what's going to be our baseline expectation for like everyone in the group. Like this is sort of the table stakes. We've all got to do this, right? We've all got to, for instance, at Google, like we all need to take part in interviewing. That means we all need to get interview training, and we all have to like help share that load for the team, so you don't have just like one person who's doing all the interviews, right? And that's just taking up a lot of their time. You got to make sure that everyone is sort of doing code review and like sharing that responsibility. So it's not just falling to one or two people who happen to be very quick or proactive code reviewers. And that's another thing that's like hard to do as a manager, that expectation setting, because I don't like the idea of feeling like I'm bossing people around. And so giving people feedback like that, like, hey, I need you to do more of this, has always been very difficult for me, because I'm like, it's cool, we're friends, whatever. And it's like, it's like that doesn't work so well. Like once you are in that sort of manager report dynamic, like you kind of have to set that expectation for people. So that's been another big adjustment for me.
Has that been more difficult in 2020? Because just like I know, even for myself being a manager, it's like you really have to almost have an unlimited amount of flexibility from the just empathy side as a human being going through 2020. Like we're all, who knows what's going on in our personal life, and we have to extend lots and lots of generosity there as a manager. But at the same time, we're still responsible for delivering and meeting our goals and OKRs and everything. So I guess you just came into this role in 2020, so maybe there's no contrast, but has that been an extra level of just difficulty?
I think so, yeah. It's definitely been something that I'm very cognizant of. I know that burnout is a huge problem in tech, and this year has made that worse because people are having, one, a harder time disconnecting from work. They're like, I'm at the same desk all day. And two, suddenly I manage folks who are new parents. And so they're like, I'm trying to do my job, and suddenly I have like a 2-year-old like climbing on top of me, and like I just cannot get the work done as a result of that. And it makes perfect sense that you're like, yeah, your world has been turned totally upside down. So yeah, it's something that I've tried to be really cognizant of, and it does. I acknowledge, like, it makes the expectation setting harder because it sort of feeds into that where I'm like, I don't want to cause burnout, and at the same time, like, I need people to hit a certain expectation, because if they don't, it's sort of just shifting the work to other people on the team potentially, maybe burning them out. Or I'm like doing more of the work like after hours. Again, this is that resisting that urge to just be like, oh, I'll just do it myself. So yeah, it has been really tricky. I hope that like in 2021, 2022, I'll be like, oh, that was like I got like expert mode my first year of managing, and it's more straightforward. I don't know if that'll be the case. Like, I imagine it's kind of like this always, but definitely, yeah, the pandemic has not helped. I will say that, I mean, it's been a good personal growth development experience in at least like some regard. I feel like it has definitely forced me to try to work on being empathetic and understand where people are coming from, and if for instance we're setting direction for folks, like also really really doing the work to help them understand how to get there, so it doesn't feel like they're not being supported. So I'm not just like assigning a bunch of orders at them and then like walking away. So my one-on-ones with my reports tend to like run over, just because I really want to like make sure they're in a good headspace before, you know, sending them off to work on something.
Yeah, it's funny because we always had personal problems and we always had to deal with them. But I feel like before COVID, it was like, okay, once you enter the building, now you have to shut those off and just focus at work, right? And now, because everything is so blurry, and it's always have been blurry, right? We are one person, not like two separate entities, you know? So I feel like at least what's happening is that managers are being more sensitive to those issues, right? And trying to understand, like, even that situation with like new parents, that's something that is so sensitive, right? And it's impossible for you to like demand the same level of work. But you're right. Like, if you also don't put that bar, then, you know, other people in the team are gonna suffer. It's a really hard challenge, right? It's so tough.
Yeah, it's definitely been a challenge. Thankfully, I think one of the things that I love and feel very fortunate in is that within developer relations, I feel like this is just an amazing bonus of working with this group of people. I work with a team of people who are really, really good communicators, which is kind of why they got into the job in the first place. I feel like that has been a huge asset for our group, because we've been able to really like reflect on our feelings and the way that we communicate in a way that's pretty constructive. And so I don't know, I feel like that's just something I've been thinking about this past year. I'm like, I'm very fortunate that I get to work with the particular group that I work with, because they are so good at that, and we can really talk and like think through stuff well.
And what are some of the projects that you have been working on? I know that you're doing a little bit of work on web.dev, and then there's developer.chrome.com. So yeah, I would love to hear more about like what is your responsibility there and what you guys are building.
Yeah. So I'm that's the two projects you mentioned. Those are the main things that we work on. So our team built web.dev, and recently we took over developer.chrome.com. It had been just sort of running on its own on some sort of aging infrastructure. So we took over that. Both sites are built on Eleventy, or built using Eleventy.
Nice.
Yeah, we're like we're trying to be hip with the Jamstack. And it's been pretty cool working on them. I feel like I've learned a ton. It was great being able to do a lot of coding again and design system work again. So I got to work on the design system for both of those. And yeah, like what we're doing right now is just it's just like a surprising amount of work keeping like documentation sites like that running. It feels like there's always new features that folks want to add. There's new page layouts that folks want to add. So one of the things that we did for Google I/O is we launched a new courses section. So we have our first course up, which is at web.dev/learn CSS, which is by Una Kravitz and Andy Bell, Rachel Andrew, Adam Argyle, just like the most amazing CSS people. Like I feel like we got like the like Olympic dream team of CSS, and like they went in, they put that together. So our team, built that out to make sure that would work. And on developer.chrome, we, have been doing a lot of work to update things like the documentation for Chrome extensions, make that look a bit nicer. And under the hood, what we've been doing is trying to take all of the various like API references that we have and convert them all to TypeScript so we can have sort of one pipeline for displaying API reference on developer.chrome. So it's a lot of small things that kind of add up to a lot. We just always have a bunch of different projects kind of that we're working on. There's always bugs to fix. The other big thing we're working on right now is internationalization, which has been like, I feel like it takes whatever project you're working on and just adds like an order of magnitude of complexity, because it's like, okay, take your one website and now you have 6 of it or something, and just figuring out how to make sure that things are properly indexed for SEO, that pages are still linking in the right way, that the user's language preference is being respected and remembered. All that stuff, how you want to handle community submissions. So our sites are all open source. So if someone comes up and they're like, I want to translate this page into a different language, like, what's our policy around that? So there's a lot of policy work too, like for a lot of the things I'm mentioning. So so the biggest thing is again, to try and make sure that I'm giving the team enough opportunity to just sort of do stretch goals and grow and build interesting new features and really like own those new features. And making sure that we're kind of going through a good process too. So even though like it's weird, sometimes I feel like I'm like the bureaucracy cop a little bit. Like I have to be like, wait, before we do this, like I know we can just start writing code, but before we do this, we got to write a design doc. We got to like get all the sign off from all the stakeholders. Like we got to do all those things. And everyone's like, fine. And I'm like, I know. But like I feel like that's a big part of it too. It's just making sure we're doing all that process work. So, at an organization like Google, probably the hardest part is just cross-team communication, making sure everyone else is aware of the things that we're doing, right? So later on, or, so they can add it to their roadmap, for instance. They're like, oh, you have a courses thing now. I wouldn't have known about that otherwise. Cool. Maybe our team will write a course, or, oh, y'all are supporting other languages now. Great. We have a bunch of docs, which are going to be particularly important for this part of the world, So that's a big part of it, is just making sure that I'm helping to delegate the work out, but then also we're doing a good job to communicate to all the different teams within Google. And there's so many of them, like, hey, here's what you can do on these sites now.
Totally. Yeah. I'm like wondering how like you navigate through that organization, right? Because I believe there's so many different stakeholders, and even for something like a documentation, I was like thinking, oh, I really thought that Google would have some sort of framework for documentation, because there's so many different developer products, and you can see some kind of consistency between some of the docs, and you can see some really nice patterns. Like I remember seeing Firebase, and they have like, okay, when you select a certain language, okay, they save that preference on your local storage for certain code snippets, or they have like light and dark code snippets, not the whole page for the code snippets. So I would imagine, oh, maybe they have something, but like the organization is so big, right, that I imagine like, no, like it's not always the case that you can reuse things, and sometimes you have to write your own, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's almost the opposite. It's not that we have one thing. There's like a bunch of things that you could use for documentation. And I think the tricky part about our group was we originally started using some of those internal projects. But it's uniquely difficult, I think, for our team, the web developer relations team, to use those projects, because we also really, really like to sort of like walk the talk, so to speak. So if there's like a cool new feature, like we want to put it on the site, you know, or if there is some metric that we need to hit. So core web vitals is a really big topic right now, right? And so like we have to make sure that the site meets those vitals targets. And if it and I think one of the problems that we ran into, and I think this is true at any organization when you're sort of like working with another team or it's some other group that actually owns the platform, is you're like, if I need this thing fixed, like how am I going to get that prioritized? So in our case, we just got, I don't know, I guess a little impatient. We were like, let's just do it ourselves. So we just there was a little bit of prior art. V8.dev had launched a blog on Eleventy, and we were like, this is rad. They're like kind of doing their own thing. Like, let's just do it. Let's just do our own thing. And I feel like it's worked out pretty well. Like I feel like it's helped our team increase their publishing cadence. So the rest of Web DevRel, I feel like, is publishing more content now on web.dev than they were prior to its existence. We were sort of fragmented before. We were publishing in a lot of different places. So I think it's been helpful in that regard. But yeah, like the downside though, right, is now there is a group of us whose entire job is really to maintain this stuff, right? We have to like keep it all running. So you have a certain amount of headcount now that's just dedicated to this, the infrastructure work, basically. So that's one of the trade-offs that we decided to make, and I think we're actually still pretty happy with that trade-off. I think it's been good. It's been fun being able to just be like, I'm trying to think of like a recent thing that we added. It's a good example. I mean, Core Web Vitals is actually one of the biggest ones, right? As soon as it came out, we were like, cool, we have to start optimizing for this. And we just got really aggressive about cumulative layout shift and LCP and all these other things. And we're in such a better place now than we were, right when all that stuff was first rolling out. And I think it's just because we were able to move faster, because we're like a smaller group and we could just control everything. But yeah, there's pros and cons for sure.
What have you learned so far about documentation? Like, what makes a good documentation? Because you're serving millions of users with those two sites, right? So what are the common patterns that you see now?
Yeah, there's I wish I could remember. I'll try and maybe dig up the name and maybe we could drop it in the show notes or something. There's a really good documentation set that one of our tech writers pointed us to, where they're like, there's really 4 kinds of docs. You have like, and depending on what mindset the reader is in, they might want a different kind of doc, right? So you have like an introduction, you have more of a tutorial, you have more of a guide. I can't remember the 4 off the top of my head, but that was one of the things that just sort of stuck out to me, as I was like, oh, there really is like an anatomy to the different kinds of docs, and it really does matter what the person wants in the moment. And if you're launching some new, API or feature or something like that, you kind of need all 4, right? Sometimes people love the like big conceptual, like, let me understand how this thing's working under the hood and why it exists and everything. And then sometimes folks are like, I was told I have to fix this thing. Show me how to find it in DevTools. I would like to close this bug before I go home. And I like find myself in both of those spots like a lot. So I think that's been an interesting one. Is just thinking about the anatomy of your documentation. One of the things that I found that I like harp on a lot, I really care about, is I love looking at courses from someone who like really knows the particular topic area that they're working in. Not so much because I want them to teach me the concepts of, hey, here's how this thing works. I think what I actually really like is seeing their methodology. Like, I like seeing how people work. So this happened recently where we had already built web.dev using Eleventy, and Andy Bell, who runs a site called Piccalilli, he put out a course called Learn Eleventy from Scratch. And we've been working with it for like a year, but I was like, I want all of us on the team to go do Andy's course, because Andy is really smart and he makes really, really great content, and I'm sure we're going to like learn some stuff from this process. And again, like it wasn't about, hey, here's how the different tags work in Eleventy. It was just fascinating to see Andy put together a project. Like this is like kind of how his brain works when he's thinking about plugging in Sass, plugging in his JavaScript, and organizing his templates and things like that. So one of the things that I feel like is missing so much from documentation is kind of like that piece where if I'm, for instance, reading the Firebase docs or something, it's cool to get the conceptual thing. It's cool to get the tutorial or how to use particular tools. But I also really, really want like, you know, David East or somebody who I just know like lives and breathes Firebase to show me how they just build something real. Like not a toy, but something real. And I feel like you just learn so much seeing that person's methodology. And so it's a lot more time investment to create those kinds of resources, and they're pretty hard to update. But that to me it's just like gold, you know. It's just so fascinating when you can get those things. It's one of the reasons why I'm excited about the work that the team did on the Learn CSS course. Yeah. But it's also just in general, I feel like it's almost like a missing pillar for documentation. Like if you're launching a new product or something, I'm like, oh, you should have an expert like just build something real in it and share that with people, and people will learn so much from that.
Yeah, so one of the things that I really love about Learn CSS is how they do like a really good job in like doing a step-by-step guide on how to do like really scoped features of CSS, right? They have illustrations to explain how to use a certain property. They have a podcast on each article. And that's really special for beginners, you know, because that's a really good way to navigate that content. And I feel like if you treat documentation with only one format, like let's say you only have API docs or you only have articles that are beginner-like, you know, you kind of forget that every person is on a different journey with that technology, right? Some people, they just want to like look at it and understand the overall concept. They're just like putting their toes and trying to understand, is this the right thing for me? And then others are like, oh no, like I know this, like everything about it. So I want to understand like deep architectural changes and necessities there. So I like that idea of looking at your documentation with different kind of layouts and different kinds of strategies for articles, right? And sometimes folks just have one structure, one layout, and they're tailoring for one like specific persona, right? So that's a really nice thing that you guys are doing on web.dev, like because there are people in so many different steps, right? I believe like do you guys know like, okay, who are accessing the site? Is it more advanced folks or beginners? How do you see that?
That's a great question. I wish we did a better job collecting that data. That's something that's kind of on our radar right now. We're just starting a program. So you won't see it right now because right now on the site there's a banner telling folks about Google I/O, but it'll be going back up next week. There's a banner for a program that we're working on, essentially to kind of like recruit folks into almost like a focus group, like an ongoing focus group, so we can ask them questions about the site or about like other initiatives that we're working on. So there'll be a banner to sign up for that. So yeah, that's one of the things that we're trying to do better this year is just understanding our audience more. When we launched the site, I think we sort of had like an idea of what we wanted to do. You know, we're like, okay, cool, yeah, we want to we're like, we don't want to teach like JavaScript like 101, like to the point of saying like, here's what a variable is, here's what a function is. That may actually change over time, but that was where we were at when we were first launching the site. We're like, okay, we're not gonna do the very basics, but we're gonna try and do more intermediate stuff. Some advanced stuff. We really want to kind of target like the middle, I guess, so to speak, of the developer bell curve journey, whatever. And we want to make it like interactive. So we try to do a lot with like embedded glitch and code pen and stuff like that. I think one of the things that's been really interesting about working on the project is how it's evolved over time, or our thinking has been evolving over time. When the site first launched, we were also really focused on tooling, which is why we have the measure section on the site. We're like, we're going to do this whole thing where we're going to, you'll go and you'll run Lighthouse and we'll point you to all of our documentation, and it'll be this great loop where you're just going back and forth between the docs and Lighthouse and the cloud. And I think what we started to realize over time is our team wants to talk about so much more stuff than is covered by Lighthouse. Like, it's cool, Lighthouse is great, and it does some amazing things. But, like, we also want to let Adam and Una write about, like, CSS position sticky, right? And that's, like, not really something that Lighthouse really cares about. So I think one of the things that's been interesting for me is just sort of seeing how our thinking about the site itself has just been evolving over time. And now we're like, this is kind of more of a reading experience, and maybe we need to lean more into that. Like, the tooling stuff is cool and it's very nice to have, but how can we make this more of a personalized reading experience? So that's something that we're trying to look more into as well. Like, can we start recommending content to people? Can we let them follow things that they're interested in? Can we just personalize the whole thing more so we can help you discover stuff on the site that you might be interested in? And also, like, our team produces a lot of content. We have YouTube shows, we have like other podcasts and stuff that our team works on. Can we like incorporate that stuff as well, so people are like, okay, cool, I it's not just articles about position sticky or CSS, but now I can see Una's talk from IO, or some cool like short, I don't know, TikTok that Adam did. I'm just making that part up. We'll see.
That'd be awesome.
But like, can we start to like knit these other platforms in? I think it'd be pretty cool.
That's cool. Like, you're talking about personalizing the experience of docs, and I know like accessibility, which is, I guess, one form of personalization, has been really kind of dear to your heart through your whole career. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, why do you care about that? What's been some of your contribution to that world?
Yeah. So accessibility is something that I actually, it was something that, like, I feel like a lot of developers, I was kind of aware of it for a big part of my career. I didn't really understand how it worked. I might occasionally see ARIA attributes sprinkled on some code, maybe if I was using Bootstrap back in the day. I think that was the first place I saw ARIA attributes. And I'd be like, okay, cool, I guess I shouldn't remove these. I'll just leave them there. They seem like someone put them there for a purpose. Or, like, I might occasionally get a bug that says like, hey, I can't operate this thing with a keyboard. And I'm like, okay, cool. Go to Stack Overflow and Google, how do I make this thing keyboard operable? And when I was working on web components and working with the Polymer team, early on, I don't feel like accessibility was really on our radar, and I feel like this is actually kind of the detriment of web components. It was, I think folks were so focused on, hey, you can build these amazing widgets, that there was not enough consideration paid to, okay, that's great, but how is everyone going to access these things? And at the time, I was really, really fortunate that Alice Boxhall, who is an accessibility engineer for Chrome, just happened to sit like right by me when I was working with the Polymer team. And she was talking with some folks about building a course on accessibility. And she's like, I don't even remember how it quite started. I feel like I just kept turning to her, asking her questions, because people would be like, you can't do this with Polymer, you can't do this with Polymer. And I'd be like, how does this work? How do we do this? I don't really know. And so eventually she's like, I'm working on this course. Would you like to work on this course with me? This would be a good opportunity, right? You can learn about accessibility, how we do it with web components. We can like share the load on this thing. And that was such a just amazing experience, and I feel so fortunate to have gotten to do that with Alice and to like learn about accessibility from just an amazing expert. Like, that's like I don't know, it's like Jimi Hendrix being like, you want to learn how to play guitar or something? Like, it's just this person who's literally doing the thing, like making accessibility work in Chrome is like, let me teach you how it works. So that was just so cool. And so we made that course, and I feel like it completely changed the way that I think about building UI elements, and just building websites. For like a number of reasons. One, like, it's just, you start to realize how inaccessible so much of the web is. And what's frustrating about it is how close it is to being accessible usually. It's not often that much work to take something that you just literally cannot use and is a barrier for people and just make it work. Like, it's usually just not a lot. So it changed my perspective on that. It also, I feel like, fundamentally made me a much better front-end engineer and UI developer, because I think about components differently. Like, when I'm building a piece of UI now, I plan the keyboard states as like, that's like the starting point. That's like the first thing that I do. And I'm like, okay, cool. Well, you can use, like, let's say we're building tabs or something like that, right? Like, you're going to need to be able to use the arrow keys to move between them. The home and end keys let you jump back and forth between the first item and the last item in the list. And so you start thinking, okay, well, how am I going to represent that state? And by the time you have planned all that out and done that, then just like adding a mouse click is like the easiest part. You're like, oh yeah, it's just like one of these. It's just like, go to last state, go to current state, whatever. So I feel like that was the other thing. I understood UI better, and I felt like I started building things better because I was planning for accessibility from the beginning. Which is why, like, I think I just want more folks to be into this space, because it's just gonna, it increases access to their products, but it also just, as from like a pure sort of like craftsmanship standpoint, the thing they build is just going to work better. It's just going to be nicer to use. It's just going to work better with a keyboard. It's going to work better in unexpected states that they maybe weren't planning, but thankfully now it's like in there that, oh hey, focus can just sort of arrive in this thing like magically, right? But thankfully you plan for that, and so it doesn't render all broken or something. So I don't know. Yeah, that to me has been great. And the thing that I've been trying to work on now is a few web standards related to accessibility. So we're working on one in CSS called Focus Visible, which helps sort of unpack when the browser draws the focus ring, which I think is something that is often frustrating for developers and sometimes surprising. And then the other thing we're working on is an API called Inert, which lets you say, okay, hey, this thing has been drawn to the screen, but I would like it to be inert, meaning the user cannot like move focus into it, or a screen reader will ignore it. And that can be really helpful if you need to animate something that maybe is full of like interactive bits. So you might think of like, one of the things we built a while back was a Twitter carousel for the Google I/O site. And a tweet is actually just full of like links and all sorts of clickable things. And if you have a Twitter carousel with like 50 items in it, you don't want to trap somebody in there by accident they're using, let's say someone has a mobility impairment, right? So they're using a switch device to navigate the page. It's very, very easy to create a tab trap where they're just stuck and they can't access anything else on the page because they're just stuck in this thing because there's 50 cards full of links inside of them. But what you can do is you can make them all inert, right? So you can say, oh, okay, we're going to animate these things, we're going to move them around on screen, but really only one of them is actually interactive right now. So the user can get in there, they can interact if they want, and they can bypass it. So that's what I've been working on lately. And web standards is a totally different beast to developer education. It is completely different and much harder. And I'm not very good at web standards, but I'm trying.
Why do you think like some folks don't pay the right attention to accessibility? Like I feel like there's so many people, just like with performance, right? Developers are usually really focused on the business logic. They want to get that done as soon as possible. And performance is the last thing they do, or accessibility is the last thing they do. So why do you think that's the case?
I think honestly, it's because it's just not something that's as familiar to people. There's a few reasons. If 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 you don't have any form of disability, and if nobody on your team has any form of disability, it may not be top of mind to you, right? So that's one reason, right? Sometimes people just aren't thinking about it. The other is that, I mean, I think it is fair to say that accessibility, like ARIA and things like that, they're kind of difficult. It's this whole other skill set that you got to learn. You got to learn how the semantics work. You got to learn how, in ARIA, you've got to have ID references to say, okay, this thing's going to control that thing over there, or maybe its active child is this one way down here in this list, and you're going to have to generate a bunch of IDs at runtime to create all these linkages. And I think performance is kind of the same way, right? Where it's harder to debug. You've got to get into Chrome DevTools, and you've got to use the performance inspector, and you've got to break out some flame charts and things like that. And all of those are whole other domains that you've just got to spend a bunch of time learning about and practicing. Whereas I think business logic can sometimes be more intuitive, because you're like, well, the thing either works or it doesn't, right? We know what we're trying to achieve. You click the button, the thing shows up, or the form submits, or whatever. And so I definitely don't think, I know sometimes people think that developers are being like lazy, or that they don't care or anything like that. I don't think that's the case. Like, I don't think anyone sets out in the morning is like, I'm gonna build something totally inaccessible and it's like rubbing their hands together like a supervillain. I just think that that it is like, this role requires learning so much, right? And we're all at sort of different points of the developer journey, and there's only so much that we can kind of fit into our brains, especially with like the stress of, I've got to deliver this thing by Friday. And so folks are trying to fit in as much as they can. I think one of the things that's a bit of a bummer is, I don't know how, I'm actually curious how the two of you arrived in the web developer profession, like how y'all got into it. Because like, if, for instance, if you went through traditional like computer science or anything like that, because I went to design school and kind of like taught myself coding along the way. And I feel like a lot of people who do web or front end stuff have that kind of background where they're sort of self-taught, or maybe they do have a CS background, but the web was not the majority of that CS degree, right? Yeah. And so a lot of folks are coming to web programming with kind of a sort of a patchwork knowledge, where they might be really good in particular areas and might not know other areas at all. And so since we're missing a lot of those fundamentals, we have to teach them to ourselves in our own like off time and things like that, right? It has to be a lot of self-directed learning. Whereas when I got out of design school, I had this whole background in like color theory and like 2D layout and 3D layout. Like, it was like all these like fundamentals were like in place, and it's very different for web developers. So what I'd like, right, is for it to be more of a track that people could go down. Accessibility is one of those fundamentals that you learn. Yeah. But I don't think that's the case for most people. Yeah. But what about y'all? Like, how did y'all arrive at the web?
I think Johnny's story, like, I went through the traditional path, I would say, like CS type of degree, and then, but of course, like, they didn't focus on web. But I was told, like, okay, if I want to be a successful software engineer, I have to work with Java, with SAP technologies, and but I wasn't drawn to that. I loved HTML, so I decided to just go with that. But there was obviously not enough content, and it was really hard to learn. But Johnny's path was way different than mine, right, Johnny?
Yeah, I studied communications in school, so not like technical at all. I didn't have any emphasis on front end or development or anything. But when I started working at LifeRay, I came in kind of through the UI intern door, and that flowed into actually developer relations, and then like product management and security. So like I didn't spend all that much time on front end. I was able to just kind of dip my toe and I think kind of get a taste for it. But even that short time, I can relate to the fact that it's totally a patchwork of knowledge, right? So you have like a limited amount of problems you can solve, and you just slowly, incrementally, expand on that. And so unless there's a motivation or a need to actually like peel off that part of the onion, then it's just like not gonna happen in one sense. It's not gonna be aware of it and not gonna know how to do it. So I think what you're sharing is totally right, and it makes me wonder if there's a sponsorship problem as well. Like if we're getting demands from somewhere, whether it's like some sort of business team or a product team or something, and if those demands don't include accessibility or performance or security, like all those kind of peripheral elements beyond just the basic functionality, then oftentimes it just doesn't happen. At least that's been my experience and my, like, from even what I've observed. So do you agree with that, Rob, or are there other hurdles that you can see as well?
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. I think if, like you're pointing out, if it's not part of the project requirements, right? If the customer wasn't asking for it or something, then yeah, it's going to be out of sight, out of mind. And I think the other thing that happens sometimes is companies may hit a certain size where they start facing lawsuits, and at that point, the company, and I mean, it's like, it's kind of a bummer that this is what moves the needle, but it does move the needle. Yeah. Like it's a bummer that it has to get to that point for people to be heard, but we've seen like positive impacts from it where companies are like, okay, well, we want to avoid a lawsuit, so we're just going to make this now company policy that like the things that we ship have to be accessible. But I think that only really happens when companies are either a certain size or perhaps through random chance, depending on their user base. And so you end up, with this sort of middle area where there's just lots and lots of companies and lots of products where it wasn't part of the requirement spec and they haven't faced any legal action. And so, and if their developer team doesn't have a few people in there who are accessibility champions, it's just not on the radar for them, and that's kind of a huge bummer. And it's really hard to figure out how to improve upon that. I think there's definitely a limitation to like what the browser can do. There's limitations to what assistive technology can do. Like these things are trying to sort of shore things up as best as they can, but at the end of the day, it really comes down to developers and what they're building. I guess one thing that makes me hopeful or happy is that it definitely feels like I'm trying to reflect on, and maybe this is just like a side effect of the social media bubble that I'm in now, but I feel like it's being talked about a lot more. It's much more on the radar for developers now. I feel like a lot of critique is directed towards like boot camps, that they don't cover it, and so I think maybe some more of them are starting to cover it. So I feel like it's in the conversation a lot more, and there's a lot of really good material out there to teach it to people. But I think it's always going to be a bit of an ongoing battle, especially because the web moves so fast and the UI patterns that we build change so frequently that I feel like we're pretty used to certain UI patterns now, like infinite scrolling lists, right? Let's take that as an example. That's something that, like, when I think I first started doing web development, and I was, if you go all the way back to like the CSS Zen Garden days and stuff like that, like we didn't have infinite scrolling lists, and now we do. But like that's a new-ish pattern, and it is hard to make new patterns accessible. It takes a fair amount of thought and planning, and you've got to come up with a paradigm that works well for users, that can be taught to users, that can understand, and just as quickly some other pattern comes along, right, and replaces it or becomes another part of the lexicon. So it's always moving, and it's just an ongoing challenge. Yeah, again, like performance, I think it's just one of those things where I'm not sure how best to address it, but I like that it's at least in the conversation, and hopefully more organizations make it a policy to adopt it. Maybe one potential place where it could be getting better is you start to see component libraries caring about it a lot more than maybe they used to.
Yep.
You have things like JSX, like A11Y linters and stuff like that. They're really like integrated into these tool chains. So that's another area where there's a lot of improvement, I think. Just like having it be at the framework level or at the UI level and the UI library level. So developers maybe don't have to do everything themselves. They're able to sort of get that boost by using something that is already kind of like known good.
Yeah, I'm hopeful too, because like I see how popular Bootstrap is and Chakra UI, and I see they're all investing on this. So at least that moves the web forward because there's so many people consuming those patterns, right? And I feel like the crucial piece maybe with that comparison between accessibility and performance is that since like the early 2000s, 2010, there's been a lot of resources about how performance affects the business and how 3 seconds affects X $1 million in sales, right? So it's so clear for business stakeholders to prioritize that and make sure that it's like top of mind, right? Even though we are like, not all of us, but most like developers, they're sometimes located in privileged areas with privileged internet access. So even though like if you're living in a third world country, by being a developer, you probably have like better internet access than other folks. So you are using like you're testing in a really well established environment, and it's that kind of thing that we always hear, right? Oh, it works on my machine, and if I have that sort of experience on my machine, then everybody will have it, and that's definitely not the case. So maybe that's one aspect with the whole accessibility conversation, that if we can show more of those use cases that, okay, by making this accessibility change, we translate it into real dollars, then that could help with the whole conversation, right? But it's still really difficult. It's an uphill battle for sure.
Yeah, it is. I think one of the stats that gets shared is you have like 15%. So 1.5, not 50, 15% of the world's population with some form of disability. And so collectively, you're talking about like $1 trillion in capital there that can be spent on products. So there is definitely a financial side to it. I'm also hoping that maybe like, I feel like the past 2 years have caused us to do a lot of reflection on equity and inclusion. And my hope is that helps with it too. Like just more people just being more educated about their own privilege, how the work environment or the setup that they have is different from other folks, and all these things, like making sure that people have an equal shot in the workplace, like all this stuff I feel like is kind of in the conversation, like in the mix right now. So that's another thing. Maybe people will hopefully reflect on it a little bit more. And when someone brings up an accessibility issue, they're less likely to ignore it or pass it off, and they can actually be like, okay, hey, this is what we've been talking about this year, right? This is an opportunity to actually improve the experience for someone and boost them up so they can like, complete this experience or do whatever tasks they need to do. So I'm hopeful there, but yeah, I think it's always going to be a bit of an uphill battle, but that's okay. That's why we do it. Just got to keep at it.
Like one other thing that I would be, I'm really curious to hear from you, because we work together in web components projects like webcomponents.org, Polymer, but I have been personally like not super involved these days. So I'd love to hear from you, like how do you see the whole web components ecosystem right now, and what is your opinion on it? Like, is it all where you want it to be? Could it be better or not? Like, what do you think?
Yeah. How much time do we have? I can try and give like a quick answer. So we use web components on web.dev and developer.chrome. We don't do the thing, we don't build the entire site as one giant web component. I feel like what we do instead, which I found to be a really, really good relationship, is we use a static site generator. It has its own kind of, templating library or whatever that it wants to use. And for the most part, I mean, pretty much entirely, both of our sites run without any JavaScript whatsoever. Like you can read the content no matter what. And then there are areas where we want to just sort of augment the experience, right? We want to add some behavior. And so we lazy load in custom elements that wrap light DOM content. And, if the JavaScript loads, then it just imbues that content with a little bit more behavior. And I've really, really liked this pattern. I think I saw in the recent Lit conference that they were running that they have a plugin that they're working on to do, I think it does declarative shadow DOM. I hope I'm not misquoting or anything, but I think it does declarative shadow DOM with Eleventy. And that's another thing that I'm really, really excited about. Declarative shadow DOM is so cool to just be like, here is a shadow root. You just write a shadow root in HTML and it just works. And you don't have to write any JavaScript to make that thing go. So I'm hopeful that kind of the combination of declarative shadow DOM and the popularity of static site generators is going to, I think all this is sort of like slow going, but it'll slowly get more and more people into custom elements. I think the one thing that was probably not great about the way web components rolled out in the first place was they were sort of pitted against frameworks. And I think on the Polymer team, we're like super guilty of a lot of this, right? It's trying to sort of be like, hey, we're also like a framework and you don't even need these other frameworks because we got this thing. And I think in practice, like that just doesn't really play out. Like I think a fire engine's going to drive by. Sorry about that. But I just found that like custom elements just work well as an addition to whatever it is you're already working with. They're cool to like sprinkle in, I think. They're great for certain UI components that you want to reuse. Like if you have something and you're like, I want a really special drop-down widget or whatever, it's great for that kind of stuff. But it doesn't obviate the need for, using Angular or using React or Vue or whatever to say, I want to orchestrate the rest of this page. And if anything, I just think they sort of like gel nicely together. So that's the setup we've been using, and we've been like really happy with it.
Yeah, I like that progressive enhancement type of approach, right? And I feel like the first web component that I saw running in production with GitHub.com, I feel like that is the pattern that they use, right? They have like those timestamps. So when you load, you have the information there, but it's a much friendlier way when they like have that web component triggered and then it shows up like in a friendly format. So yeah, that I like that tip for folks who are wanting to learn more about web components and trying out on their sites. And I love that approach of, okay, we're not against frameworks, like we are together, and you can use both at the same time.
Yeah. One thing that I found is just really nice about the component stuff is it is very fun and liberating to be able to open like CodePen or whatever and just start kind of like writing out like a tag, and not really have to pull in any other tooling. Like you don't even have to think about anything else yet. You're like, I just want to like work on this behavior, and it's just very handy to have this thing that you're just like inside of here is like a little scope, and I can kind of just like muck around with it if I need to. Like I think that's very, very useful and really good for like sketching out ideas. One of the things I'm also kind of interested in is I think there's a project called Headless UI, and I think it's very, very interesting, this idea of building like components with no real style whatsoever, and then just being like, like bring your own style. Like I love that. I really, really want to see more custom elements that do that sort of thing. And then another weird thing that you can do, which I just think is very interesting. I don't know if it's a good idea or a bad idea, but I'm kind of into it. Is this is kind of related to accessibility, but there are certain patterns that sometimes you need to add to controls, and oftentimes we write a bunch of JavaScript and we just sort of like hide it in the JavaScript file for that control. So to give you an example, again, we'll use like tabs as an example, right? Sometimes you just need to be able to like hit the arrow key and focus the next thing in the list, right? You're just like, I just want the arrow keys to be able to navigate this thing. And so I wrote like a custom element for that recently, just called roving tab index. And so you can just like put like children inside of it, and it'll be like, okay, cool, now you can just arrow to these children. And you don't have to rewrite that same JavaScript over and over again and plug it into all your different UI elements. If you want, you could just sort of like abstract that into a little tag. And again, I don't know if it's like a good idea or a bad idea, but it's kind of like a fun idea to play around with, of like, yeah, sometimes I just have like a behavior sort of like a flourish or something that's useful for user navigation. I just want to like add this. I just want to like sprinkle this in. I feel like that's another potential use case for web components that I'd like to see people explore more, because I think it could maybe be good. Like, here's my analytics tag, like weird little stuff like that usually we only think about putting in a JavaScript file, but like you could maybe just make a little configurable element for it.
Wow. I feel like we could go for like a whole nother hour. There's so much good stuff here. But we love to close out with the same question for all of our guests, and that is, what is a tool, whether it could be a physical thing, it could be a software that's kind of like on your desk in your workspace that you're really loving right now?
A tool that I'm loving right now.
And full disclosure, actually, before you answer, I read your like how I work blog post, and I've been using Roam for a long time, and I haven't been using it enough to want to really pay for a subscription. So I just switched to Obsidian because of you mentioning that, and I'm loving it so far. So thanks for the reference, but I want to let you answer it.
Yeah. Yeah, no. Obsidian's really cool. I love any of those tools, like Obsidian or Notion or Roam, where you can just brain dump. Like, I do a lot of that. I actually think like Todoist is still the thing that I love the most. And the reason why I love it is, I think like one of the most important things, like I'm always fascinated by how many tabs people have open on their computer. And I'm like, I like don't like if I have more than 4 tabs, I get really, really stressed out.
Yep.
And I see people with like 1,000 tabs. I'm like, how do you do that?
Yep.
And so I feel like Todoist or one of those note-taking apps is helpful, because you can say, I'm going to take this tab, whatever is the salient stuff from this that I need to know, like a sentence, and I can just put it into this to-do, and I can file it away. And if it's really, really important, I will come back to it, right? And what that allows me to do is clear out my focus for when I need to actually work. Like the thing that, kind of going back to an earlier point, like whatever is most important for me to be working on right now, if I have a bunch of tabs open, invariably I will get distracted by those tabs, and I will just start looking at them. So the reason why I love these tools is just because it lets me almost like let my brain go a little bit off duty, where I can be like, you don't have to like continue this like mental cognitive burden of like looking at that tab every few minutes to be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna get to that. I'm totally gonna get to that. Like, we're gonna put this in the filing drawer, put this away, and we're gonna schedule it. We're gonna schedule it for 2 days from now, and now we can finally do this like most important thing from today. Like, we can clear the brain, and because I feel like if not, then I have there's like tiny little fractions of my brain that are sort of on duty, that are just keeping track of all this other junk on my screen, being like, don't forget this, don't forget this, don't forget this. And having that filing system, any system that you can stick to, is really, really important. So for me, Todoist is the thing I just, for whatever reason, keep coming back to. So that's my tool of choice. Yeah.
What about pin tabs?
Pin
Do you
tabs?
use them?
I do use. Yeah, okay. So pin tabs rule. I have every day. I have the same pinned tabs. It's Todoist, Gmail, Calendar, and Chat, and they're like pinned and they just take up the little tiny bit of space over there, right? So I'm like, okay, y'all can stay. Y'all are
Standby
allowed.
mode.
And then, yeah, and then there's the other like 3 or 4 articles that I'm reading. But I mean, seriously, like I'm aggressively anti-tabs. Like I try and close all of them by the end of the day. I don't like having any open tabs if I can avoid it.
I love that idea, like the concept of having almost like an abstraction layer for your priority list or your task list or whatever. Like you mentioned that, and it like made sense of something that I've like thought of before, but I haven't been able to put into words because I'm always trying to reduce systems. I'm like, if I have to update something in multiple places, that's bad. At the same time, though, being locked into like a prescribed system, like a Jira or Monday or whatever, and then you can't add like your other little things that don't fit that. So you talked about having like one that you can kind of have full flexibility, dump things in, no one else is seeing it, there's no obligation, you can prioritize whatever. Makes total sense to declutter your mind and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Like especially at a big organization, you're always going to end up with multiple tools, right? Or it's so hard to get everyone to agree on one tool. And so it's nice to have just one place where you're like, I am in total control of this thing.
Yep.
Here's my brain, and it can just point at all of the other tools. That for me has been very helpful.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Well, thanks, Rob. For all of you listening, watching, please like, subscribe, follow, comment, all the good stuff. If you're listening now, thanks for getting to this point. Rob, thank you so much for your time. This was really a really enjoyable time to chat about a lot of this stuff. And we'll catch you on the next one.